Good afternoon, it's a pleasure to be here. I brought some Sewanee weather with me. It's like this every day back in Sewanee, even though it may not be in Richmond. I'd like to thank Todd for organizing this trip and for showing me around today and arranging meeting with students, and I'm looking forward to having some dinner with some more students tonight after this. I'd also like to thank Nancy for all the logistical help that she gave me, and the Environmental Studies program, the Department of Geography and Environment, the Department of Biology, and the International Studies program for helping make this possible. And since the clicking is gone, it's up to me to annoy you, right? To drive you crazy. So I'll do my best in the next little bit. So what I'm going to tell you about is my year-long watch at 1 square meter of old-growth forest on a mountain slope in Tennessee. And that project resulted in a book. I'm going to do a few short readings from the book, but also give you some, this talk is not just about the book, it's about my experience there, my reflections on doing that. Partly it was about writing, but partly it was about learning some more biology. And so I watched this 1 square meter and saw a kaleidoscope and a soap opera, a dance, a tragedy, a starburst of life in this one little area. And from that came a whole lot of realizations that I sort of knew intellectually as a biologist, but I didn't, I realized afterwards, truly know until I had this year out in the woods. And that also provided some fodder for my writing. So why did I undertake this project? Now I'm kind of standing there looking back on this. If I placed myself back a few years ago before I started this and asked why? Why sit in the woods for a year and watch one patch of dead leaves and see what would happen? Partly it was I wanted to go to nature without an agenda, to listen and pay attention and just see what I could learn. Now, as a teacher, I go to nature a lot with an agenda, right? So there's a lesson plan for today. We're going to be studying natural selection or the carbon cycle or whatever it is in our course sequence. And that's fine, that's great, but if you didn't have a lesson plan, at least some of the time, you wouldn't be a very good teacher. As a scientist, I go to nature with an agenda, hypothesis, so I've got a grant, I'm meant to be collecting this data and so on. And so you're going there with a focus. And again, that's great, there's a place for that. But I had this sense that there's also a place for opening my senses just to see what I could learn. Now, of course, you can't fully open your senses. You always go with it. Sensory filters, we can't even see certain wavelengths, we can only hear certain frequencies of sound. We come with intellectual preconceptions, emotional commitments. But what I want to do is take on the discipline of trying to let some of that go and to see what would happen. So that's the first and sort of personal motivation for this as an experiment, if you like, in observation. Second, I wanted to tell the stories of the forest. The top of my head gets blown off every other day by some amazing thing that somebody discovers. It's published in Science magazine, Proceedings of the National Academy, or other scientific journals. Remarkable things being discovered about the world in which we live, right? We only know of one world, and it's this one. And through science, people are learning more and more about how this world came to be, how it functions. And yet those stories are hidden. Unless you're reading like conference proceedings from scientific conferences or thumbing through Science magazine, that is totally unseen to you. So I wanted to get those stories out there. So in some ways this project was, the writing part of this project was an extension of what I do as a teacher. So really take the walls of the classroom, bust them out and see if we can get these stories out there. Because there's a hunger for that, for knowing our world. And we're in a sort of educational philosophy where people from 18 to 22 go to college, take a bunch of courses, and then you're out there and you're meant to stop learning? I don't think so. And people who are truly alive are usually the ones who found a way to continue learning, and continue engaging through the rest of their lives. This book, I would hope, could help those folks along the way. So this talk and this book and so on are about science communication. I'm not here to present the results of my original research on snail evolution or exurbanization and conservation. I'd be happy to talk about those afterwards. This was really about how do we find those interesting scientific stories and not just tell them, but sing them. Try and make it so it's just people love this and just can't wait to get more. So the guiding metaphor for the writing part of this is the Tibetan mandala. And what mandalas take many forms, but often they are a circle of sand about this wide, made from colored sands that are arranged in very intricate patterns with all sorts of symbols and images and so on. And there are lots of levels of significance in a Tibetan mandala. But ultimately, as I understand it, I'm not a Tibetan Buddhist. You might have guessed by my accent that that's not where I'm from. But my understanding is that ultimately it's a reflection and a recreation of the whole universe and the whole path to enlightenment. And so the idea is you see everything within just that one circle. And the circle that I watched in the forest was the same size as one of those mandalas. And some mandalas are small, some much bigger, but mostly they're about this big. So it's about 1 square meter. So I call this thing the Forest Mandala. So what I'd like to do now is read a little bit from the preface to explain how that whole mandala thing connects into ecology and what I'm trying to do here. I believe that the forest's ecological stories are all present in a mandala-sized area. Indeed, the truth of the forest may be more clearly and vividly revealed by the contemplation of a small area than it could be by donning 10-league boots covering a continent but uncovering little. The search for the universal within the infinitesimally small is a quiet theme playing through most cultures. The Tibetan mandala is our guiding metaphor, but we also find context for this work in Western culture. Blake's poem, Auguries of Innocence, raises the stakes by shrinking the mandala to a speck of earth or a flower. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower. Blake's desire builds on the tradition of Western mysticism, most notably demonstrated by the Christian contemplatives for St. John of the Cross, St. Francis of Assisi, Lady Julian of Norwich. A dungeon, a cave, even a tiny hazelnut could all serve as lenses through which to experience the ultimate reality. This book is a biologist's response to the challenge of the Tibetan mandala, of Blake's poems, of Lady Julian's hazelnut. Can the whole forest be seen through a small contemplative window of leaves, rocks, and water? I've tried to find the answer to this question, or the start of an answer, in a mandala made of old-growth forest in the hills of Tennessee. The Forest Mandala is a circle a little over 1 meter across, the same size as the mandala that was created and swept away by the monks. These are Buddhist monks who visited and made a mandala. I chose a mandala's location by walking haphazardly through the forest and stopping when I found a suitable rock on which to sit. The area in front of the rock became the mandala, a place I'd never seen before, its promise mostly hidden by winter's austere garb. I sit next to the mandala on a flat slab of sandstone. My rules are simple. Visit often, watch a year circle past. Be quiet. Keep disturbance to a minimum. No killing, no removal of creatures, no digging in or crawling over the mandala. The occasional, thoughtful touch is enough. I have no set schedule for visits, but I watch here many times each week. This book relates the events in the mandala as they happen. So what I'm doing is using that 1 square meter as a device to focus my attention, as a way of structuring a narrative, of telling some stories, as a hook, one that, to get people interested in reading these stories, one that perhaps runs against the grain of the hypermobility and the globalization that is such a part of our culture. And my argument here, and my what I believe is globalization, mobility are not bad things. It's good to be in conversation and be trading with people in other parts of the world. But it's hard to have that conversation unless you know your place. You have little to bring to the conversation if you have no clue where or who you are. So that was part of my hope here. And of course, the 1 square meter becomes a lens through which to see the world. And that's the paradox of contemplative practice. And it's not true just of this observation of a mandala, it's true of other deeper forms of contemplation like meditation. That in focusing in on one breath, on one little visual icon, on a patch of forest, you're drawing your attention in, and in doing so you see more. And a very simple way to sort of illustrate this is to think about flying across the country. So you fly from Seattle to New York, 5-hour flight. What's the overwhelming feeling? Boredom, right? You're stuck on this plane. It's like, okay, 3.5 hours, only another hour and a half. Okay, what's on the movie thing or on my laptop? Or restlessness and boredom. Now spend the same amount of time on a stroll through any point along that flight path. It could be a national forest, national park, it could be a suburban neighborhood, it could be an urban area. Spend that same amount of time at a slower speed, and it's amazing. All this cool stuff is happening out there. And so the claim here, or at least my opening gambit, is that wonder increases with decreasing speed. The faster you fly across a continent, the more boring it becomes. The slower you move and the more attention you pay to your place, the more interesting it becomes. So let me show you some slides from in and around this area of forest, just to give you a visual sense of where we're going. This is the Cumberland Plateau here. This is the western edge of the Appalachians. A sandstone, here's the point, a sandstone cap on the top, going down to limestone at the bottom. Nashville is across this way, so this is looking west. Sewanee, the town is back over here, on the edge. And the place where I sat is just around the corner here. So this is patches of old growth embedded in some forest that has been cut over, even some parts lower down here farmed early in the 19th, well, for parts of the 19th century, and then got abandoned and was regrowing. Is the sandstone on which all this sits. Of course, deciduous forest. Species community is quite like that around Richmond. We're about at the same point in the early spring in Sewanee now as you are here. Fall, of course, makes not quite New England because we have fewer maples, but a great mixture of trees. Here's hickory tree in full golden blaze in the fall. Hickory trees produce hickory nuts. An important part of the ecology is all this energy stored in condensed little areas in nuts. You can hear the hickory trees in the autumn or even in the late summer by listening for the gnawing sounds of the squirrels. Like this, and then you can walk right up to where the hickory trees are. You get a sense of the species diversity in the forest by looking at this slide from the fall. Each tree here looks different, and that's because each tree, almost every tree here, is of a different species. You know, they have different colorations and they lose their leaves at different times. This mixed forest on the mountain slopes is quite diverse. It's not a uniform standard, just one species. Then, of course, in the winter, canopy opens up. We get a lot of rain and mist. And then in the springtime, the spring comes up like a rising tide, the green coming up from the valley. You're looking down 1,000 feet here, so at the bottom it gets green first. And in the summer, just like here, it gets hot and humid. This is not a cool, cloudy day. This is the water has nowhere else to go. It just comes out in these great billows of humidity. Early spring, canopy hasn't quite leafed out. What we have underneath is an enormous array of herbaceous and sub-canopy plants growing in great profusion there. Many of these plants rush through most of their life history in the first few weeks of spring when the trees have not yet leafed out. There's lots of sunlight coming through, and they can do their flowering and a lot of their photosynthesis in a very short period of time. This is in the summer with the humidity in the forest. And this is a Christmas fern, mosses growing underneath on rocks in particular. And what's this plant? I know we got one person who knows the answer to this. Chickweed.
Giants?
Yeah, so this is the native one. There are other chickweeds and exotic ones. Lots of trillium of different species, Kimiatum. These are spring beauty flowers. I counted over 200 of these in just the 1 square meter. These things grow in quite amazing profusion. They have pink pollen. So in the springtime you have the little native black bees all dusted in pink flying around. Great. Okay. Here, this is actually taken at dawn. The flowers are closed up to defend themselves against nighttime raiders of pollen and nectar. Hepatica. And then, of course, lots of animals down in the leaflet. This is an earth snake, spring peepers, box turtles. This one is a male with the red eyes. So these are the classic animals of the eastern forest. And in southern Tennessee, we've got a lot of land snails. Snails usually fly below the radar. Usually they don't fly at all, but there are dozens and dozens of species, maybe over 100 species just in our one county. You go next county over and it's a different bunch of species. So some extremely rich snail fauna, and those, of course, are most of those on the forest floor. You sit and watch for a while, you start to see all these different forms, all the different morphological forms. And one of the things I do with my research is study the genetics of these guys. It turns out there are a whole load of probably undescribed species in our area. Their shells take on sometimes some quite beautiful sculpture. This is Haplotrema, which is a predatory land snail. So land snails are probably these innocent little grazers. These ones go and spike other snails with their lance-like mouth parts, drag them off to their lair and eat them up. So snails are not quite as pacific as they look. This is a phyllomycid slug, a native slug. There are lots of invasive slugs in eastern North America now. This is one of the native ones, hangs out in the woods. A young Tridopsis, I think, here. So, sitting watching the forest floor, lots of invertebrate animals, big spiders. This one's almost as big as your hand, gets in your face as you walk through the woods. And then lots and lots of fungi. Anytime you've got old growth, you've got lots of down wood, lots of leaf litter on the ground. So profusion of different fungal forms. And these are the real engines of decomposition in many parts of the forest. This is most of us. Coral fungi, algae growing on top of fungi. So life layers on to other life forms. And this is one little rock a few inches across, at least 10 different types of lichen on this one little piece of rock. So maybe for my next book I'll write one about one rock. I need to learn some lichen systematics first. Some more lichens looks like a moss, and back to our escarpment. So sitting in the woods for a year here, just watching, seeing what will happen. So what did I learn and what did I want to communicate? One thing, and I know there are biologists here, and this will not come as news to you, but one thing I really saw and understood at sort of quite a deep level is that the world is ruled by the inconspicuous proletariat. We big things, like the animals, the mammals and the birds and so on, we're just hood ornaments. The rest of life is like behind and mostly not as noticed as us sort of large things. And we don't have even the sensory ability, in many cases, to notice and realize these other creatures. So what I'm going to do is just share a couple of 2 or 3 paragraphs here to sort of illustrate how I tried to convey to people who are not familiar with forest the enormity of both our ignorance and of the importance of these creatures. So what I'm doing here is lying down on the forest floor, my face pressed to the ground. I tease away a wet sandwich of 3 maple and hickory leaves. Waves of odor roll out of the opening. First, the sharp, musty smell of decomposition. Then, the rounded, pleasant odor of fresh mushrooms. The smells are edged with a richer, earthy background, the mark of healthy soil. These sensations are the closest I can come to seeing the microbial community in the soil. The light receptors and lenses in my eyes are too large to resolve the photons bouncing off bacteria, protozoa, and many fungi. But my nose can detect molecules that waft out of the microscopic world, giving me a peek through my blindness. And a peek is about all that anyone is given. Of the billion microbes that live in the half handful of soil that I've exposed, only 1% can be cultivated and studied in the lab. The interdependencies among the other 99% are so tight, and our ignorance about how to mimic or replicate these bonds is so deep that the microbes die if isolated from the whole. The soil's microbial community is therefore a grand mystery, with most of its inhabitants living unnamed and unknown to humanity. As we chisel away at the edges of this mystery, jewels fall out of the eroding block of ignorance. The earthy smell that embraces my nose comes from one of the brightest jewels, the actinomycetes, strange semi-colonial bacteria from which soil biologists have extracted our most successful antibiotics. Like the healing chemicals in foxglove, willow, and spirea, those are plants I discussed earlier in the book, the actinomycetes use these molecules in their struggle with other species, secreting antibiotics to subdue or kill their competitors or enemies. We turn this struggle to our advantage through medicinal mycology. Antibiotic production is a small part of the huge and varied role of actinomycetes in the soil's ecology. There is as much diversity within the feeding habits of this group of bacteria as exists within all of the animal kingdom. Some actinomycetes live as parasites in animals. Others cling to plant roots, nibbling on them while fighting off more damaging bacteria and fungi. Some of these root dwellers may turn against their hosts and kill the plant by below-ground assassination. Actinomycetes also coat the dead bodies of larger creatures, breaking them down into humus, the dark miracle ingredient of productive soils. They are everywhere, but they seldom enter our consciousness. Yet, we seem to have an intuitive understanding of their importance. Our brains are wired to appreciate their distinctive earthy smell and to recognize the aroma as the sign of good health. Soil that has been sterilized or that is too wet or dry for most actinomycetes smells bitter and unfriendly. Perhaps our long evolutionary history as hunter-gatherers and as agrarians has taught our nasal passages to recognize productive land, giving us a subconscious tie to the soil microbes that define the human ecological niche. So what I'm trying to do in chapters like that is sort of raise up the proletariat for the hood ornaments to see and appreciate, and then tie it in a little bit with our own story. What does it mean to be a human? It means to live on productive land, and if you're not on productive land, you've got a hard time making it. And so, and my sort of opening set of assumptions in this is that we are evolved creatures, just like everything else, and so our brain recognizes our habitat. So what else did I learn? Well, opening in the forest opened up my senses, gave me a richer experience of the physicality of the world, and it helped me understand the world in the forest in new ways. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. One, I was sitting on my rock, as I'd done many times before, trying to melt into the rock and be still. And what happens when you do that is the big animals come to you. So little birds start sitting on your feet. The chipmunks in the woods are normally rather shy, sort of start scurrying around you and so on. The little raccoons come and crash into you. A deer came up to me and stopped like this far away and realized, whoa, this is a human. That it looked like a dead bear, or probably smelled like a dead bear as well. There's a lot of deer hunting in our region, so deer, particularly on this mountainside, have a fear of humans. The ones in town don't. You can walk up to them and pretty much pet them, but these ones still have a fear of humans. So it gives a snort, dances away, flashing its white tail, snorting. You've probably heard that deer snort if you've been around particularly suburban areas. So that's unremarkable, right? Okay, I saw a white-tailed deer in the woods. Whew. Pretty rare thing. Almost snow leopard-like. What happened though was that snort started, and then the chipmunks started up, chip, 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 and then a wood thrush further down the mountain started whipper, 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 and then the squirrels in the trees, and these waves of acoustic alarm spread out through the woods, Because I'd been sitting there long enough, I'd slipped into the acoustic network without even realizing it. And from then on, I heard the forest in a different way. I could be sitting on my rock and I would know that people were coming down a trail. There was a trail further down the mountain. Long before they got to me, or I heard them or could see them, you could hear the bow waves of alarm coming ahead of them. It's like, okay, there are people coming, because the wood thrushes are doing the sound and so on. So all the animals in the forest, not all I should say, all, but many of the animals are tied in this social network of communication, of links. They're listening to one another and eavesdropping and getting good information. It makes sense if you're a wood thrush to pay attention to the alarm of a deer, or to the fact that these chickadees and titmice are going crazy over here. So from that, I realized that the social network of the forest is one of its more fundamental characteristics. We tend to focus on the individuality of ourselves and of the biological world. And yet, and that's true, we do exist as separate physical individuals. And yet the other fundamental reality is we're tied in these networks of relationship to one another. And for humans, it's language usually that is connecting words are the way that my consciousness goes straight into the center of your consciousness. For other creatures, there are different mechanisms, and let me just share a few paragraphs from one of those essays. Okay, 186. So the animal's acoustic network has an invisible analog among the forest plants. When insects chew on leaves, they trigger a physiological reaction from the host plant that not only deters further damage to the host, but also alerts neighboring plants. Damaged leaves turn on genes that produce a flush of chemicals. Some of the defensive chemicals evaporate and perfume the air around the wounded plants. The wet interior of the neighboring plant's leaves is soaked in these molecules. And like the aroma in a human nose, the molecules dissolve and move into the surrounding cells. Here, the chemicals turn on some of the same genes that produce defensive chemicals in the original plant. Unwounded plants around a damaged colleague therefore become less palatable to insects. The trees are listening. When I sit or walk in the forest, I'm not a subject observing objects. I enter the mandala and I'm caught up in webs of communication, networks of relationships. Whether or not I am aware of it, I change these by alarming a deer, startling a chipmunk, or stepping on a living leaf. Dissociated observation is not possible in the mandala. The webs change me also. Every inhalation carries hundreds of airborne molecules into my body. These molecules are the aroma of the woods, the combined fragrance of thousands of creatures. Some aromas are so pleasing to humans that we've domesticated them, extracting perfumes. At least one such perfume, jasminate, is an alarm chemical, communicating danger among plants. Perhaps our olfactory aesthetics reflect a desire to be wedded to nature's struggle. But perfumes are the exception. Most of the forest molecules bypass my sense of smell and dissolve directly into my blood, entering my body and my mind below the level of consciousness. The effects of our chemical interpenetration with plant aromas are largely unstudied. Western science hasn't stooped to take seriously the possibility that the forest, or the lack of it, might be part of our being. Yet forest lovers know very well that trees affect our minds. The Japanese have named this knowledge and turned it into a practice, shirin-yoku, or bathing in forest air. It seems that participation in the mandala's community of information may bring us a measure of well-being at the wet chemical core of ourselves. So that little passage, and there are other parts of the same chapter, about chemical interpenetration with the world, which is what every time we inhale, we're inhaling some kind of molecule that passes into our blood and then into our nervous system. And it's also trying to convey some of the ways in which animals and plants interdigitate and communicate one with another within the forest. Okay, another thing I try to do in this book is offer some reflections on our relationship with the world, not in a prescriptive way, but to explore the intersection of natural history, evolutionary biology, and environmental ethics. And I take this from a number of different angles in the book. I'm going to share one chapter here. This is about, starts off talking about fungi from close observations of the forest, and then moves into some other issues. So I'll skip over the bit that gives some fungal details. But my eyes meander over the mandala's surface, delighting in the profusion of fungal bodies. 2 white domes at the mandala's edge eventually catch my attention. The spheres emerge from the receding tide of decomposing litter. I reposition myself to get a closer look. Golf balls, like a discarded beer can in a stream, or bubblegum stuck into the bark of a tree. These plastic globes seem profoundly ugly and out of place. The golf balls were sent from the flying from the high bluffs that overlook the mandala. A golfing friend tells me that shooting a ball from the edge of the cliff gives him a thrilling sense of power. The golf course extends to the cliff edge, providing ample opportunity to indulge this buzz. Most of the balls land to the west of the mandala, where local children gather bagfuls to sell back to the golfers. Glossy, white, plastic balls are visually startling in the context of a forest. But the balls also jar because they have arrived from a parallel reality. The mandala's community emerges from the give and take of thousands of species. A golf course's ecological community is a monoculture of alien grass that emerged from the mind of just one species. The mandala's visual field is dominated by sex and death. Dead leaves, pollen, birdsong. The golf course has been sanitized by the Puritan life police. The golf green is fed and kept trimmed to keep it in perpetual childhood. No dead stems, no flowers, no seed heads. Sex and death are erased. A strange country. A dilemma. Should I remove the balls or leave them nestled in place? Removing them would break my rule about not meddling in the mandala, but taking them away would restore the mandala to a more natural state and might make room for another wildflower or fern. Discarded golf balls have nothing to contribute to the mandala. They don't decompose and release their nutrients. They don't become another species' habitat. The grand cycle of energy and matter seems to halt when it reaches a dumped golf ball. My first impulse, therefore, is to restore the mandala to purity by removing the plastic balls. But this impulse is problematic for 2 reasons. First, removing the balls will not cleanse the mandala of industrial detritus. Acidity, sulfur, mercury, organic pollutants rain in continually. Every creature in the mandala carries in its body a sprinkling of alien molecular golf balls. My own presence here has undoubtedly added strands of worn clothing, alien bacteria, and exhaled foreign molecules. Even the genetic code of the mandala's inhabitants is stamped by industry. Flying insects, in particular those ancestors who have come near humans, carry resistance genes to many pesticides. Removing the golf balls would merely tidy up the most visually obvious of these human artifacts, preserving an illusion of the forest's pristine separation from humanity. The impulse to purify might fail on a second, deeper level. Human artifacts are not stains imposed on nature. Such a view drives a wedge between humanity and the rest of life. A golf ball is the manifestation of the mind of a clever, playful African primate. This primate loves to invent games to test its physical and mental skill. Generally, these games are played on carefully reconstructed replicas of the savanna from which the ape came. and for which its subconscious still hankers. The clever primate belongs in this world. Maybe the primate's productions do also. As these able apes get better at controlling their world, they produce some unintended side effects, including strange new chemicals, some of which are poisonous to the rest of life. Most apes have little idea of these ill effects. However, the better informed ones don't like to be reminded of their species' impact on the rest of the world, especially in places that don't yet seem to have been overly damaged. I am such an ape. Therefore, when a golf ball in the woods strikes my eyes, my mind condemns the ball, the golf course, the golfers, and the culture that spawned them all. But to love nature and to hate humanity is illogical. Humanity is part of the whole. To truly love the world is also to love human ingenuity and playfulness. Nature doesn't need to be cleansed of human artifacts to be beautiful or coherent. Yes, we should be less greedy, untidy, wasteful, and short-sighted. But let us not turn responsibility into self-hatred. Our biggest failing, after all, is lack of compassion for the world, including ourselves. Therefore, I resolve to leave the golf balls in the mandala. I'll continue removing strange plastic objects from the rest of the forest, but not from here. There's value in keeping a patina of naturalness along hiking trails and in gardens. Our harried eyes need a visual break from the productions of industry. Keeping the woods trash-free is a symbol of our desire to be more careful members of life's community. But there is also value in the discipline of participating in a world as it is, discarded golf balls and all. Yet, the utter indigestibility of golf balls seems an affront to the mandala's other creatures. 18th and 19th century golf balls were biodegradable, being made of wood, leather, feathers, and tree resin. Modern, ionically strengthened thermoplastic balls cannot be eaten by bacteria or fungi. 1 billion golf balls are manufactured each year. Are they all destined for a brief bounce on the green, then eternal life as garbage? Not quite, is my guess. The golf balls in the mandala will continue to sink through the litter as the biological material they rest upon decays. In a few years, they will hit sandstone and lodge between the jumbled boulders that underlie the mandala. Here, they'll be ground to ionically strengthened thermoplastic dust. The escarpment on which we sit is receding eastward, so the golf balls will join the slow rumble of grinding rock, and the little balls will be pulverized. Eventually, their atoms will settle into new rock, either in a compacted layer of sediment or a hot pool of magma. Golf balls don't end the cycle of matter as they seem to. They take mined oil and minerals into a new form. They soar briefly, then return the atoms to their slow geological dance. Another fate is possible. The earth stars and mushrooms that ring the mandala's golf balls may devise a way to digest and recycle the ball's plastic. Fungi are masters of decomposition, so natural selection might produce a plastic munching mushroom. Stupendous quantities of matter and energy are locked up in plastic. Evolutionary triumph awaits the mutant fungus whose digestive juices can free these frozen assets and conjure them to life. Fungi and their equally versatile partners in the business of rot, bacteria, have already shown themselves capable of thriving on other industrial innovations like refined oil and factory effluent. Golf balls may be the next breakthrough. Are you listening? Plastics. There is a great future in plastics. So what I'm doing here is making an argument for a widening of the circle of empathy to include ourselves and other creatures. Elsewhere, I get in this book into this artificial wedge between the rest of life and humanity from a different perspective, arguing that the division between humans and the rest of life on the basis of, say, consciousness and other things has little empirical basis. So I'd like to close here with the next 5-10 minutes with some reflections on this book and on why close observation of our places, of our homes, matters. And I give that the general term natural history, the study of natural history, as many other people do. These other species that we share our places with are our kin. That is Darwin's fundamental claim. You look at an oak tree and trace its lineage back long enough, and you look at me and my lineage back, there comes a time when we came from the same organism, or the same different organisms within the same species. But based on sort of genetic theory, it turns out that it's pretty likely we're in the same organism at some point. So we're visiting with family, getting to know the relatives when we go out and do natural history, and that has inherent value in and of itself. Some of the family are going to drive us crazy, the mosquitoes and so on. Others will enrich our lives, but in general, knowing one's family, I think, is generally would be a good thing, as is knowing one's community and how it functions, whether that's the human community or the biological and physical community that we're embedded in. There's also practical value in studying natural history in the biology and the geology and geography and so on of our places. We can't hope to manage or conserve the world as we must now with 8 billion people and expanding appetites without knowing the world. It's like being a stage director for a play without knowing the players, the plot, or anything. And yet, I think a lot of education in both conservation biology and in wildlife management, other types of management, is about the ideas, the theories that are divorced from place. And those ideas and theories are really important, but they're almost useless unless you know what it is, you know the organisms that you're managing and conserving. We get ourselves into a lot of trouble if we don't do that. And the particularities of things matter. So twigs, what could be more obscure than a twig? Well, global carbon budget depends on the particularities of how twigs and roots grow and on how the soil decomposes the litter that falls on it. And there are a few things more important now than the global carbon budget to our future as a species and to the future of the rest of life. So there are practical benefits. I think some of this spills over into some policy arenas. For example, in Tennessee, there is a move afoot to regulate what can be taught about sexuality in public classrooms. In fact, this was up before the legislation now, and the law is going to say nothing but natural human reproduction. So natural is put right into law. If these legislatures knew what nature produced on the spectrum of sexual diversity, they might have thought twice about putting that in there. So now, nature cannot tell us what is right or wrong. Natural history cannot inform us about what kinds of sexuality are appropriate or inappropriate. We've got to derive our ethics, our morals from other places than the woods. However, natural history can teach us to and inform these debates by falsifying some of the more blatantly inaccurate depictions of what is natural out there in the world. For example, most of the organisms I showed you on these slides are hermaphrodites. And yet within hermaphroditic species, you have a certain percentage that are unisexual, either male or female. Within Homo sapiens, most people male or female, 1 or 2% hermaphroditic. So any law that say marriage is between a man and a woman leaves out some of the sexual diversity of Homo sapiens that isn't informed by our own biology. Likewise, of course, with relations between and among sexes, sexual relations. Nature has a great diversity of natural ways in which organisms relate to each other sexually. that information is completely absent from the current public debate, particularly in the South. And I think natural history could, if we looked outside at the pear trees, the Bradford pears growing outside the Tennessee legislature, and the bees on them, and the little invasive chickweeds down below them, we might realize that nature is perhaps not something to put into law quite so lightly. On a more academic level, natural history, the study of natural history, I think offers a challenge to how intellectuals think about knowledge. Mobility is the name of the game within academia, right? So you go to high school one place, undergrad somewhere else. If you stay in the academic realm, grad school's probably going to be somewhere else, then a postdoc, then your first job, maybe your second job, all in different places. So the questions you ask have to be mobile. You have to put them in the U-Haul and take them somewhere else. You may be in Virginia now, in California in a couple of years for a different thing. So the nature of knowledge, what even counts as knowledge within academia, is transformed by the mobility of our culture. Our knowledge is dislocated. And that would be pretty strange for our ancestors, right? For whom knowledge had to be located for it even to be useful and to count as knowledge. My argument here is not that universal scientific knowledge or questions in other parts of the academy are not valid. They are extremely important, and they're one of the great things that we do here is sort of look for the universal, for truths, or at least for questions and ways of approaching the world that can be transferred from place to place. That's great. That should continue to be a focus. However, the pendulum, I think, has swung so far from location that we've lost sight of some other kinds of knowledge that could also count as rigorous forms of academic study. And those would be the particularities of place, familiarity with local communities and local species. Can home, can place matter within the academy? And I think that's still an open question. So I'd like to close here on a personal note and sort of circle back to that first motivation for the book, which was to observe without an agenda, and sort of fess up, put my cards on the table as well. What did I get out of that personally? I got a lot out in terms of the nature of knowledge and what's going on in the Tennessee legislature and so on. What I got was sort of opening up, not just of the senses, but deeper, an opening to two things. One is the unspeakable beauty of the world, a beauty that increased as I knew more about it and as I paid more attention. I understood my physical origin in this world and my ongoing connection to it. But I also really sensed this fathomless brokenness of things, both in humanity's connection and interaction with the rest of the community of life, but also the weight of suffering inherent within life and my irrelevance to most of what goes on in the rest of the community of life. And both of those things became very deeply true for me at the same time. And I think contemplative practice, by which I mean paying close attention to one thing over and over again, gives us a space, it gave me a space to hold that paradox, these seemingly contradictory things, to hold those things simultaneously without pushing for a full resolution of the questions that contradiction raise up. So I'm leaving you with that paradox and that set of questions, and I thank you for your attention.